Hello, welcome back to the Conifer Wood. This week I've been developing the look for Atlantic Spark Run and setting out design guides to follow over the coming weeks. When starting new projects, I find it helpful to get any preconceptions out of my head first and into reality, because I find myself second guessing my ideas ad nauseam if I don't, and also because it gives me a solid foundation to start working from. I find it a lot easier to critique and iterate things that are there than things that are not there, if you see what I mean. Zooming past you at the moment is a time-lapse of this first drawing, and I'll talk about my process and thoughts as we go. So what you saw just there was the only sketch I made for this drawing. I didn't want to sketch too much because I wanted to get my ideas out quickly, and I didn't think this was the time for coming up with a cohesive design. In my first video I referred to the setting as an outpost, but as you can see in this drawing it's more a boat shape. And while this makes sense, as it's going to be right out in the middle of the sea, I don't want to constrain myself too much to this idea. It can always be thrown out later. There are some versions of this design in my head where the outpost sits on a rocky outcrop, or an island of some kind, but for the time being, this is what I'm drawing. In terms of design philosophy, there were three main things that I wanted to achieve with this drawing. The first was a sense of asymmetry, as I find this to be generally more visually stimulating than wholly symmetrical designs. The second was a reduced colour palette, that you'll see a bit later, as I don't want the film to be too confusing or noisy to look at. And the third was not to really pay too much mind as to how a company would design this outpost in real life. I've been looking at reference images of oil rigs and navy ships, which have a lot of intricate and visually interesting pieces on them, but it's not really the look I'm going for. I don't want the animation to have an industrial aesthetic or appear too metallic. I want it to have a sort of otherworldly appearance, something you'd find in a retro space opera rather than out in the North Sea oil fields. There isn't really any one style that I'm trying to nail with this design. There are elements of brutalism in there, industrial architecture from the oil rigs, as well as Art Deco and Art Nouveau elements. There isn't really any meaning behind this, as such. I suppose these aesthetics just live in my head somewhere and come out whenever I start improvising. As I said before, this is a drawing of preconceptions, and there are a number of things I wanted to get in there based on how I imagined this outpost would operate. The first was this tall tower at the top, which is designed to be jumped from to catch the spark. My idea was that it would be a sort of launching pad from which the operator could fly up into the path of the spark and catch it with a modified baseball glove. And then there's a net at the bottom of the tower that would catch them as they fell back down on their bungee. Another is the giant stabilizer at the bottom. I thought that if you were standing at the top of the tower aiming for the spark, you wouldn't want to be swaying tens of meters at a time from the rock of the sea waves. It is in effect a big inverted pendulum. There's a gangplank at the front where the courier can dock to offload the monthly provisions, living quarters and a machine hall housing all the operational equipment. And lastly, there's the branding on the front. Number 4 doesn't really mean anything, but I thought that if there were other outposts arrayed along the Spark Run, then it would be useful to number them. I imagine the company would also want to let everyone know that the outpost was theirs too, so there's a made-up logo for them as well that really usefully fills the blank space that I was struggling to work out what to do with. And now we come to the colouring. I'm really not good at figuring out what swatches to work with, so my tactic is to paint in colours until I get a palette that I like, and then play around with the settings in CSP until it looks good. I started off with this yellow, blue and grey palette, but I was having a hard time getting the blue to play along, so I simplified it even further to just the yellow and a selection of similar brown tones, and it started to come together a bit better. Once all these colours are blocked in, I added some light airbrush shading and a few highlights, and then flipped through all the layer blending modes until I was satisfied. Most of this I've cut out though, because it looks horrendous when it's sped up. Now that I have my preconceptions out in the world, I can start to think critically about how I want Atlantic Spark Run to look. When I have this illustration in front of me, I'm thinking about poster art, about clean lines and block colours, about a high visual impact, whatever that means. I collected a few images from artists that I like who, to me, occupy the space that the first drawing is pointing me towards. The first is Frank Newbold, who was a British travel poster artist working in the first half of the 20th century. I picked Newbold out as I really like his use of bright colours. There's an interesting way that the colours in these pieces pop off against each other, as if they're fighting for your attention, but it never makes the image unpleasant to look at. The second is Hiroshi Nagai, who fellow city pop enjoyers will recognise from his work on album covers of the same genre. I'm drawn to his work, I think, because of his use of incredibly luscious blues, and the 80s American West Coast scenes he paints that sit in an aesthetic style that I really want to aim for. His works are often mostly sky, and a lot of them include the sea or pools. The parallels to my ocean setting are obvious, but there's something about the low horizon that gives the paintings a sense that I can only vaguely put into words. Taking off, a flight, a journey to somewhere outside the frame, an endlessness, a spaciousness. Third in the queue is Jeanette Hageland, a photographer of many stripes, but whose architectural photography is of particular note in my opinion. These photos are clean and clear, with strong forms and few but incredibly striking colours. These photos have the kind of palette I was going for in the first illustration, mostly light and gentle colours offset by darker or more powerful tones. Finally, I chose to reference the work of Ryo Takamasa, who is an illustrator whose work has appeared on many different publications across the world. His work is important to me because of the lightly abstracted and geometricised forms. The perfectly triangular hill, the regimented patchwork fields, the arrow straight rail bridge and white circle sun. These images tweak nature into elegant vector-like shapes, arranged in a way that scratches that itch I have to organise and align. These are all fairly woolly feelings I have, I know, and I don't think I've given you a clear sense of what I'm learning from each artist, but I don't like to create in that way really. I'm thinking of these more as an inspirational mood board that Atlantic Spark Run can sit among rather than take from. By the end of the project, hopefully we can look back at these pictures and see how each one has influenced the film. I wanted to set out a collection of finer grain ideas that I could work from when it comes to designing the sets and characters. Rather than considering the overall look and feel of the film, these guides help me to refine specific aspects, such as what the railings will look like or how Sally wears her work clothes. I started off gathering images of retro machinery and the interiors of submarines. Since the design philosophy of this film is somewhat nostalgic, I thought it would fit to have all the operational machinery inside the outpost to take on that beige bakelite look of early computers. There are modules here, workstations, removable panels, dials, nodes, heavy switches that give a satisfactory click, sliders, curly telephone cables, the works. What I was particularly interested in were the handles that these things had. I don't know, there's something very charming about them. The submarine elements are more pragmatic. How would an outpost at sea be kitted out with all of this stuff? I like the clutter that fills submarines. Every nook and cranny is laden with wires and pipes, processing units and flashing lights that do and say things, the things that I'm not privy to. Perhaps the viewer can experience some of that wonderful mechanical overload when watching Atlantic Spark Run too. Moving to the exterior, my thoughts on design were less clear. The first illustration was vaguely modernist, and I wanted to bring that through, but at the same time I wanted it to be a little more organic, take inspiration from some forms that the ocean hosts. The contours on the left here is where that instinct took me, and I came up with a sort of folded shape that was inspired both by the lips of the shells and the triangular shapes that can be found in brutalist buildings on the top left. As well as these, I was interested in modernist diving board designs, which have a lot of cool intersecting angles and smooth curves. This contrast of soft curves and straight lines, which could also be seen in Jeanette Hageland's works earlier, really resonated with me, and though it's still pretty vague as a design guide, it's been super helpful to keep in mind so far. Last, I looked at clothing, which I'm least confident in. Since this is a work vessel, Sally will be wearing some kind of industrial clothing, but I also wanted to incorporate punk and techwear elements in there. ASR is meant to be set in the future, though so far there's not a lot that suggests that, and I wanted that to be present in the styles the characters take on. It's also a nice contrast to the slightly campy retro aesthetic of the outpost itself, which I personally think is a little more realistic. After all, looking at people where I live, their fashion senses almost never reflect the buildings they inhabit. All this leads me to a second iteration of the first drawing that I hope to use as a basis for the style and design philosophy for the rest of the project. It's not exhaustive, it only really covers the exterior of the outpost, but I think it's enough to keep me on track, or at least as something to refer to in the future. As I let the time-lapse play, perhaps you'll see things that have been mentioned in this video pop up, and get a feel for the art direction of the film. I've run out of things to say, so for now I'll leave you with the video and some nice music, and I'll see you in the next one.